Welcome to The Debate. Today we're diving into the compelling and profoundly complex case of Itadaki Joshi Lily Chen, a figure whose strategies for extracting money from men became a pretty widespread social phenomenon in Japan and ultimately culminated in a high-profile legal conviction. This case, it's extensively documented in her own manual and through numerous legal records, and it presents us with a fundamental, quite challenging question. Do Itadaki Joshi Lily Chan's methodologies genuinely represent a kind of transactional exchange, emotional support and companionship for financial aid, or are they, at their core, a highly systematic and sophisticated form of romance fraud through calculated emotional manipulation? I'll be making the case for a more, shall we say, nuanced understanding of these interactions as a transactional exchange.
And I will be arguing that this is quite clearly a case of systematic romance fraud grounded firmly in the legal outcomes and the methods described.
So, when we examine the Itadaki Joshi Riri Chan manual, what emerges is, well, it's a meticulously designed system. It's for cultivating what she described as deep emotional connections with men, whom she affectionately yet quite strategically referred to as oji. That's a colloquial term for older men, often implying a sort of paternalistic or doting figure. Her explicit, often stated goal was essentially to empower other young women, to help them earn money, fulfill their dreams, and gain confidence by deeply understanding and catering to the emotional needs of these oji. Now, Richan crafted a very specific persona for herself and her followers, that of a pure and innocent girl, but with a carefully constructed traumatic past and specific, relatable aspirations. This persona wasn't just designed to deceive in a simple sense, but to make each oji feel uniquely valued, trusted, and crucially, needed.
Her aim was to foster what she termed ugai gachikoi. That's harmless, genuine love. The idea here wasn't about simply tricking men. It was about cultivating a profound emotional dependency, where the ojis would willingly provide financial assistance because, in her own words, "Konoko ga yorokonde koreru koto ga ore no shiawase." This girl's happiness is my happiness. Her core philosophy was quite explicit. お金を奪い取るわけではない。こちらからはおじへ信頼関係公式コミットという名の幸せを与えてあげてる代わりにお金をいただいてる。That translates roughly to not stealing money, but receiving it in exchange for giving happiness in the name of trust-building commitment. She even astutely observed that many of these OGs had yumeya yakibou ga nai, no dreams or hopes, and okane no tsukai ga nai, no real use for their money. She suggested her system offered them a profound sense of purpose, a vital emotional outlet, and maybe a reason to feel significant again.
So from this perspective, the interactions, while yes, legally condemned, can be framed as a complex, maybe unconventional, and morally ambiguous emotional transaction where both parties, in her view at least, derived some form of value that filled a personal void.
Well, I come at this from a fundamentally different perspective, one grounded in the, frankly undeniable legal and societal consequences of Richan's actions. The methods employed by Itadaki Joshi Riri Chan, and painstakingly detailed in her manual, were unequivocally a clear, calculated, and legally defined scheme of romance fraud, and I would say egregious emotional manipulation. I mean, the Japanese legal system was decisive in its judgment. She was found guilty of fraud, assistance in fraud, and tax evasion, resulting in a pretty substantial sentence, 8 years and 6 months in prison and an 8 million JPY fine. And the court's characterization of her actions was stark, damning really. Dansei shinryo tedamari tori, sono koi ni tsuke komu makora ne koko katsuna hanko. That's a truly cunning crime that manipulated male psychology and exploited their goodwill. So to view her manual as some kind of guide to emotional exchange, as my colleague suggests, is, well, it's to overlook its explicit content.
It meticulously details the use of kyogi no naiyo, false pretenses, outright lies basically to extract money. And these weren't minor embellishments. They were a whole litany of fabricated stories designed specifically to elicit sympathy and, crucially, financial contributions. We're talking about non-existent chintaihinya, rent arrears, fabricated shinjini kara shakin, debt to an acquaintance, a completely fake story about causing injury in an accident, jiko o okoshite chijin ni kega o sase, and even a non-existent need for oya to en o kiru tame ni tekikin, money to sever ties with parents. The scale of this deception was, well, it was staggering. Over 155 million JPY from just 3 men alone. Some victims lost hobo zen zaisan, almost all their assets. That kind of systematic deception, resulting in profound financial ruin, simply cannot be reinterpreted as some benign transactional exchange. It was purely and simply a sophisticated criminal enterprise.
Okay, I certainly understand and acknowledge the legal framework and the devastating financial outcomes you've highlighted. Those are undeniable facts of the case. However, let me offer maybe a deeper dive into the actual mechanisms of the interactions Riri Chan prescribed, which I think are central to understanding the transactional aspect, or at least her framing of it. Her manual places immense emphasis on what she calls Shinrai Kankyo Kochiku Kometo, this trust-building commitment, and it was achieved through incredibly tailored and specific communication. She instructed her protégés to present a junsui mukuna onnanoko, a pure and innocent girl character. But crucially, this character came with a very specific, carefully fabricated history. DV doku oya sorachi kousotsu benkyou dekinai hirushoku tonde 20 sai kara hosu kurui. That's a background of growing up with abusive, domestic violence-prone parents, being a high school dropout, struggling with day jobs, becoming addicted to host clubs from age 20. Now, this wasn't just a random collection of traits.
Right.
In the cultural context of Japan, this specific backstory is profoundly impactful. It paints a picture of a deeply vulnerable young woman, sort of caught in a cycle of misfortune, struggling against societal odds, and in dire need of a rescuer. This specific narrative was meticulously designed to evoke profound paternalistic instincts and a powerful desire to be a tasukete ageta kanaru onnanoko, a girl who makes you want to help her. When this constructed vulnerability was combined with actively listening and responding to the Oji's own narratives of loneliness, their feelings of being sabishi to kanjiteru, lonely, and their desire for iyashi o hoshikateru, healing or comfort, it created incredibly potent emotional bonds. The detailed Kaiwashu conversation guide in her manual is, well, it's testament to her commitment to providing personalized emotional engagement, directly addressing these men's fundamental need for someone to listen, to care, and to make them feel significant. The process itself was indeed about cultivating a deep connection, however constructed its premise might have been.
While you emphasize Riri-chan's meticulous, trust-building commitment as evidence of, genuine emotional engagement, I have to firmly argue that this was, by her own admission, within the manual, a highly calculated shinrisen, psychological warfare. It was designed to create false dependency, not authentic connection. That Junsu Umukuna Onnanakoa character and its accompanying traumatic kakohen past narrative were explicitly designated as kerasete, a character setting purely for deceptive purposes. This wasn't about self-expression or genuine emotional vulnerability, it was a script. Riri-chan's goal was explicitly stated, to oji o mugai gachikoi ni suru, make Oji harmlessly fall genuinely in love. Now, this concept of harmless love, from her perspective, feels like merely a self-justification for her actions, right? Implying that if the Oji felt loved and willingly provided funds, then no real harm was done. But that completely overlooks the foundation of deception. The manual clearly teaches how to master Oji no kokoro yomitoru chikara, the ability to read the Oji's heart, specifically to understand dou yattara Oji ga jibun ni okane o watashite kureru ka, how the Oji would give her money. This manipulative intent, this systematic design to exploit deeply rooted vulnerabilities purely for profit, rather than fostering any genuine or reciprocal connection, It fundamentally undermines any claim of a fair emotional exchange. It was essentially a predatory tactic disguised as empathy, preying on a specific demographic of older, often lonely Japanese men who might be more susceptible to exactly that kind of narrative.
You're focusing very much on the intent to manipulate, which, yes, from a legal standpoint is undeniable. However, even within that manipulative framework, the method of obtaining money, the itadaki, or receiving part, was highly distinct and, in her view, wasn't outright theft. Riri-chan's method strictly instructed against directly asking for money. She understood that a blatant demand would break the illusion, break the cultivated emotional bond. Instead, her okane o itadaku toki no kaiwa routine, the routine for receiving money, focuses entirely on creating a situation where the oji would, seemingly of their own volition, say, "Tasukete agetai, I want to help you." This was achieved by presenting herself as seishintin ni tsurai, mentally distressed, often due to those fabricated financial woes we discussed, and making the OG feel uniquely special and trusted for being confided in. She specifically emphasized, "Tasukete kureru no toka, tasukete kureru kara hanasu ne toyu kanji wa dasanai koto," meaning, don't give the impression of, "Will you help me?" or "I'll only talk because you'll help me." This highly subtle, indirect approach, leveraging the emotional investment already cultivated, feels like a complex negotiation of perceived need and the desire to help, not just a blatant demand. Furthermore, her arguments against what she termed shino kotoba oji pupu kirikaeshi kaiwa, these death word oji poop deflection conversations, were not about shutting down communication. Quite the contrary. They were about systematically eliminating alternative, less personal solutions suggested by the OG. Suggestions like bengoshi ni sodan shinayo, consult a lawyer, or oya ni sodan shinayo, consult your parents. The crude OG poop label she used really underscored her contempt for any suggestions that deviated from her strategy. It effectively killed off those alternatives and reinforced the OG's unique, irreplaceable position as her sole savior. This wasn't about extortion in the direct sense. It was about creating a sense of exclusive reliance where the OG chose to provide.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was a complex negotiation, however subtle the tactics might seem. The very premise of that negotiation was built on fundamental lies. The manual's okane no nayami setting, the money problem settings, are, as we've established, undeniable fabrications. These fictional scenarios, whether it's past debts, rent arrears, or family disputes, served one single purpose: to create a manufactured crisis that only the OG could supposedly resolve. You referenced the Shinokotobo's deflection tactics, and this is precisely where the manipulative intent becomes crystal clear. When Riri-chan systematically rebuts any suggestion of external help, whether it's consulting a lawyer, a parent, or even using a different financial mechanism, she demonstrates a deliberate, calculated strategy. Its goal? To isolate the OG, to make him the sole, viable, and indeed, the only financial provider. Her detailed instructions on how to subtly imply her dire situation, making the OG feel immense pressure, if not outright obligation, to offer assistance. That points directly to a coercive strategy, not a truly voluntary, love-driven donation. This systematic dismantling of any alternative solution, this absolute funneling of the OG's resources towards her, unequivocally proves her intent was solely to extract money through deceptive and emotionally manipulative means. Any claim of a transaction implies some kind of genuine, if maybe unconventional, exchange. Here, the exchange was predicated entirely on fraud.
Okay, let's turn our attention then to the aftercare detailed in the manual, which I believe further illuminates the transactional aspect, at least from Riri-chan's perspective. This wasn't just about obtaining the funds, it was about sustaining the entire relationship, the whole dynamic. The extensive aftercare process, featuring seidai na kansha, grand gratitude, and these powerful reaffirmations like, Oji ga inakattara watashi ima would have shinjatteta, tomo. I think I would have died if Oji wasn't there. Served a crucial psychological purpose. It wasn't merely transactional in a direct payment sense. It was about reinforcing the OG's sense of purpose, their self-worth, and the profound positive impact they believed their financial generosity was having. This constant emotional feedback loop was designed to make the OG feel like a hero. Her strategy was to continuously shiawase wa ataete agete win-win ni naru yo ni shimashou. Let's create a win-win situation by giving happiness. And that included reassurances like kore kara saki mo issho ni ite ne, stay with me forever. This ongoing emotional validation was absolutely crucial for maintaining the emotional transaction as she saw it and ensuring continued financial and emotional support. And it's truly striking how Rita-chan, despite her methods, could claim for a time to be a 5-year player with 0 fraud reports filed against her. Now, that statistic was eventually proven false by her conviction, obviously, but it suggests that for a significant period, many OG genuinely felt they've received enough in return, a sense of belonging, purpose, happiness, that they didn't report her actions. This points to an underlying, albeit deeply flawed, arguably mutually satisfying arrangement for a time.
That's a compelling argument regarding the aftercare, and the idea of a sustained emotional feedback loop for the OG certainly warrants consideration. However, I have to draw attention back to the manual's explicit stated purpose for aftercare. It clearly articulates the objective as twofold. First, to prevent menhera oji o hikiokoshi, trouble ni tsunagaremasen, basically causing mentally unstable OG and leading to trouble. And second, crucially, to avoid exposure, because okane mokteki to baratara owari. Being exposed as money-oriented means it's over. This wasn't about genuine gratitude or fostering a win-win situation. It was a cold, calculated risk management strategy designed purely to perpetuate the fraud, ensure continued financial extraction, and avoid legal repercussions. It was a means to maintain control and prevent the victims from realizing they were being exploited.
And the ultimate tragic failure of the Victim Compensation Project, an initiative supposedly to compensate victims, vividly illustrates the superficiality of her purported emotional investment. Rita-chan's own personal demands and the complete breakdown of trust within that project led to its termination. That reveals that her care was entirely conditional. It evaporated the moment her own interests diverged from the victims' and supporters' needs. This just confirms that the aftercare was simply the final, crucial component of a comprehensive fraud blueprint, not some element of a reciprocal emotional transaction.
This discussion really does highlight the challenging task of interpreting complex human interactions, doesn't it? Especially when financial transactions become so deeply intertwined with emotional dynamics and sophisticated psychological strategy. While legally condemned, Rita-chan's methodology, as intricately outlined in her manual, I still think reveals a transactional dynamic that merits deeper consideration than just simple fraud. She undoubtedly identified and, from her perspective, fulfilled a profound emotional need in lonely men who, as she herself observed, often lacked purpose for their accumulated wealth. Through her carefully constructed persona and dedicated emotional engagement, she provided them with a potent sense of connection, validation, and a profound, albeit misguided, reason to invest both emotionally and financially. Her system, from her vantage point anyway, aimed to create a perceived win-win situation where happiness and emotional support were ostensibly exchanged for financial assistance. So this case, I think, illuminates a complex interplay of human vulnerability and perceived value, pushing us beyond maybe a simplistic understanding of outright theft.
Room for ambiguity. Her actions constituted calculated romance fraud and severe emotional manipulation. Her conviction for fraud and tax evasion, the deliberate fabrication of elaborate lies, the systematic exploitation of her victims' trust, they all confirm that her manual was nothing less than a chilling blueprint for criminal behavior. Any argument for a transactional exchange, I feel, fundamentally ignores the coercion inherent in deception, regardless of any emotional voids her victims might have harbored. The law's strong stance, in this instance, reflects the fundamental breach of trust and the devastating impact on her victims.
It proves, in my view, that this was not some complex transaction, but rather a cunning and deeply damaging exploitation.
Indeed, it prompts us to look beyond simple definitions and maybe consider the deeper motivations and consequences of such interactions, both for the perpetrators and, perhaps more importantly, for the victims who fall prey to such intricate psychological schemes.
Absolutely. This case forces us to ask, where exactly do we draw the line between seeking connection, even in unconventional ways, and outright exploitation, especially when emotional needs become monetized through such elaborate deception?
We certainly encourage our listeners to further explore the nuances of this case within the available source material, to form their own conclusions on the complex nature of頂き女子りりちゃんactions, and perhaps the societal conditions that can give rise to such profound vulnerabilities. There is definitely more to unpack here.